Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for today's presentation of language and climate. This is the second in our monthly series about the intersection of language and sort of whatever you can imagine. This series is made possible by the Mandel Foundation, and their support is going to allow us to bring you this language and intersection every month. So we're looking forward to that. I'm Rebecca Roberts. I'm the curator of programming at Planet Word. If you are a member of Planet Word, if you found out about this program because you're already on our mailing list, thank you for that support. It's really important. It's why we're able to keep admission to the museum free. If you found out about this from someone else who sent you a link and you'd like to know more about our programs, planetwordmuseum.org is our website. You can sign up for the newsletter there. You can follow us on social media. That's where we announce upcoming events and programs. We are starting to bring back a few more in-person events as well. So if you're here in Washington, come visit the museum and play around because it's really cool, but also come to the events we have coming up. I'm delighted to welcome Alice Bell. She is the Director of Communications at Possible, which is a climate action group in the UK. And she has a new book out about the history of the climate crisis called Our Biggest Experiment, and a PhD in science communication, all of which is to say her job is to communicate what is going on with the climate to a wide array of the public. So the perfect guest to discuss the language of it. Alice Bell, welcome to the program. Thank you so much for being here.
Hi, thanks for inviting me.
So I started to say a history of the climate crisis, and then I realized that was already a choice, right? What we call the change going on with our climate depends on where you are in the world, what your position on it is, when you're speaking, who you're speaking to. What's your term of choice?
Yeah, well, actually, when I pitched the book, which would have been, well, when I first started thinking about the book, which would have been about 5 years ago, I called it A History of Climate Change. And I used to find that people would be a bit confused when I was talking about it. They'd be like, oh, right, so you're going to talk about like how the Ice Age, and they'd be talking about like the history of the Earth. And I was like, no, I'm talking about human history. So like, and then people would be, and I was like, well, no, the thing I'm talking about is this like thing that we're doing now, climate change. And then people started talking about the climate crisis. This new phrase sort of emerged with people like Greta Thunberg saying, we need to call it a crisis. And there was a sort of activist push to say, we should call it out as a crisis rather than just climate change. And you had groups like The Guardian change their style guide to say that, where they will say the climate crisis, not climate change. And I was like, I mean, I was a bit ambivalent about some of those kind of campaigning approaches, but I was like, this actually is really helpful for me, because the thing I'm writing a history of isn't like climate change in general. It's this very specific thing, which is humans burning a lot of fossil fuels and doing various things in agriculture, which leads to increase in carbon dioxide levels to create global warming, like what sometimes used to be called anthropogenic global warming, if you want to be more scientific about it. And so that actually helped me explain to people what my book was about. And that's one of the reasons it's in the title. Although something I did notice, I've got a copy here. I've got the English copy here. There's the British edition. It's a history of the climate crisis, and the American edition is exactly the same, but it's an epic history. Because the Americans are like, it's history of the climate crisis.
But climate change is not a neutral term itself. It was, at least in this country, really pushed by a Republican strategist named Frank Luntz.
Well, yeah, I mean, people have, I mean, it's one of the reasons why people don't like the expression climate change is that, you know, some people have tried to use particular version of these phrases because they say, oh, it's helpful to my ideological end, whether it's on a pro-action on climate change mode or otherwise. People often say this about the phrase global warming as well. So that when The Guardian changed to say that they would say the climate crisis rather than climate change, they also moved to say global heating rather than global warming. And they did that because they said it was more scientifically accurate, but also lots of people said, oh, we like the phrase global warming sounds nice, you know, a bit of warmth sounds nice. And I think that has been used in the past. I mean, I personally think that now the phrase global warming has come with so much baggage. I think the same is true for climate change as well. Most of us, when we hear it, we think that's a bad thing. And so various people may have attempted to use it in some way in the past to sort of go, oh, this isn't quite so bad, but you know, most of us see that as a bad thing. You know, it's not the same as a kind of nice warm bath. you know, that phrase actually comes from a scientific paper in 1975. Like, you know, that it's not like it was invented by some kind of strategist. And you know, climate change wasn't invented by a political strategist either. The people have been talking about that for years. But yeah, they all are loaded. They all get used by lots of different ways. One of the reasons why I'm a bit skeptical about, like, when the Guardian moved to the climate crisis and global heating is that I think people can attach slightly too much assumed power to some of these phrases. Like, words are really important, you know. Your audience know this more than most people. Like, you know, words are important, but you're not going to have some magical phrase which is going to unlock action. Like, I think it is good that people are using words like crisis and emergency more and reflecting on the importance of that. But it's not, you know, the Guardian's shifting to say climate change rather than the climate crisis isn't going to suddenly make us all take action on climate change. Just as, you know, you can spin things in particular ways to make it sound less dangerous, but equally, if you're living in the middle of a storm, that might well be more powerful to you.
Right. Words have a power, but only up to a point.
Or in their context, you know, yeah.
Right. Well, also, I think we become so immune to them. They become sort of mental furniture after a while. And, you know, climate change to climate crisis is an example of that. It sort of makes you rethink what it is we're discussing. But it seems like it continues to escalate. I've heard climate emergency, climate catastrophe. I mean, what word is next? How can we possibly keep ramping up the urgency under that phraseology?
Yeah, I mean, maybe that's appropriate. I think one of the things that is noticeable about the phrase climate crisis is I think it feels more modern. So, I mean, maybe I'm particularly aware of this because I've done a history of it. It's like you wouldn't see people use that phrase in the 80s or 90s, but I think it does reflect like this new era of climate politics that we're in the, you know, by the 2020s, we're talking about climate change in a different way from the way like Thatcher and Al Gore talked about it when Al Gore was first talking about it in the 80s. You know, it's not something that's, you know, in the 80s, people were starting to feel it. They were starting to feel, you know, this thing we call global warming or the climate crisis, but it still felt very far off as a future thing. And I think that some of us still think of it as a future problem, but it's much more proximate now. You know, we're living the nightmares that people wrote about in the 70s and when, if we don't act, this is what it's going to be like. Beyond the year 2000, it might be like this. And we're like, well, yeah, 20 years beyond the year 2000, it is like that. So yeah, and it's sort of, you know, the sort of fact that we're running out of words may also reflect the fact that we're not necessarily running out of time, because climate change doesn't necessarily work in that kind of way, but it's getting really, you know, we are getting in more and more danger and things that are getting more and more high stakes. But then there's, I guess, the other side to that is whether the urgency and the catastrophic words like catastrophe help. Like this has been a raging argument in climate comms for decades, which is, you know, whether using phrases that sound a bit scary are actually going to like galvanize people to action, or is it going to frighten you and then you just sort of hide? And I don't know the answer to that, but it's certainly something that people discuss a lot in climate comms.
Right. It is fear the emotion you're trying to elicit? No.
Yeah.
I mean, is that productive? Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, most of the comms, like psychology, there isn't enough research, I think, on this, like what impact these words have and these images have. And the little research there is would suggest that, you know, fear can be effective as a mobilizing tactic, but only so far. And you also need, I mean, I think we probably all identify this, like a news story. We've lived through a lot of this with, you know, with COVID, you know, with all sorts of other things we might have experienced. You know, a kind of shocking image will make us go, oh, and sit up. But if we just, you know, we can't live on fear alone. And so other images of hope or sense of, or ways that we can be part of solutions, you know, there's all sorts of other invitations into the issue that we're going to need around that. I think we've definitely seen, like in the decades I've been working in this, I think sort of 20 years ago, we saw a real peak in kind of, we're all going to die language, and like phrases like emergency and catastrophe, particularly catastrophe, were really, really dominant in the mid-noughties. And it kind of died down a bit, and people were talking about a bit more hopefully. We'd had the kind of language of people like Christina Figueres at the UN. She was very into saying climate and wind are unstoppable and we're going to win, and she had this sort of stubborn optimism that she wanted to bring to the climate movement. And I think that changed a lot of language from her, but from people around her. And then since the emergence of groups like XR, people like Greta Thunberg coming into the sphere, I think we've seen another kind of, I think also with just people feeling more and more scared because they're feeling the climate impacts, we've seen this sort of resurgence of kind of fear language again. And maybe we needed that, you know, maybe we were hiding from that fear, let that emotion out.
You know, like you, I am a former science journalist, and nothing works better than a good analogy or metaphor. You know, if you're trying to explain an abstract concept, it can really be useful to give the right imagery to people. And I think that's how greenhouse effect started. How do you feel about the greenhouse effect as a metaphor? Is there something better?
No, it's a funny one because it's like, you know, like if you talk to scientists, they'll be like, it's not a greenhouse, it doesn't work like that. And yet a lot of us will have learnt about this since we were a kid, and so it's really solidly in our heads. Like I probably have more experience thinking about the greenhouse effect than I do of an actual greenhouse. You see it, it's funny, like sometimes you see historians sort of say like, we're not really quite sure where it came from. Like people say various scientists kind of invented the idea of the greenhouse effect, or discovered it happening, but invented the idea of the phrase. And you look at their, like, so there's a French guy called Joseph Fourier, who we kind of, when you see these kind of basic histories of climate science, you'll see him mentioned as kind of having the idea. But he never talked about it. He didn't ever use the phrase greenhouse. And it was people looking at his work later who initially described it as a kind of what might be seen as a mini greenhouse, like you know, when you have maybe some plants under a little bit of glass, like in a small kind of miniature glass house. You know, that was sort of seen as a way of people trying to help people understand something as big as, you know, the, you know, like gases that sit around our atmosphere. Like you've got a lot of chemistry wrapped up in that. You've got a lot of planetary science. It's quite a difficult concept, particularly if you're talking about this being like the 1880s, where most people wouldn't have studied science at school. So you can see why people started to do that, and then it's just got stuck. And we know we all learn it when we're 8, and then it gets stuck in our heads. I think we maybe understand. I think actually you all know this as a science journalist, that a lot of the analogies that we have in science are actually quite different from the thing they're describing. Like there's all these history of people talking about atoms, and like in the early 20th century, you have all these weird analogies where people are trying to explain atomic science to the general public, and they talk about it being like a plum pudding. And it's like, an atom is not like a plum pudding.
Or the elastic mattress for string theory, which was one that I never wrapped my head around at all.
Yeah, like the thing you're referring to, you like kind of, so the metaphor kind of gets turned into something completely different. So like the greenhouse, or the greenhouse effect, isn't an actual greenhouse, but we still understand it as the greenhouse effect. And then maybe we can get a little bit too stuck going like, but is that like a greenhouse? So a lot of you've probably seen Don't Look Up. And you know, it uses the analogy of a comet. And we spent a lot of time talking about, like, well, I have, I'm sure a lot of people in climate stuff, maybe you all had this chat with your family and friends when you're watching it. It's like, is a comet a good analogy for climate change? We're like, well, not exactly, but that's kind of the point of an analogy, is it is different. And so the comet in Don't Look Up isn't a real comet, because we all know it's climate change. So it's this different thing. Like, it's not a comet, it's not climate change, it's a story. But that story lets us think about both comets and climate change and the world around us, because it's making something new. And I think maybe the greenhouse effect is a little bit like that. And also, I think it's just become so stuck in the way we talk about these things that we maybe just have to live with it.
Right. Well, also, I wonder if we've stopped having a particularly detailed conversation about the science at all. I mean, I feel like I don't hear that much about the ozone layer and greenhouse gases and aerosols and, you know, sort of all of the chemistry behind it. It's more about the urgency and the need for action now, without having to do a lot of explaining about how it's happening.
Yeah, I mean, I often say that for me, the biggest challenge of my work is not public engagement with climate science, it's public disengagement with the energy system. It's the fact that to have a conversation about why we need to get off natural gas and why we might move to heat pumps. Like, so I know in the US is one of the many countries around the world where people have been talking about heat pumps a bit more the last few years, and particularly the last few weeks, with, like, you know, this idea of heat pumps for peace, that Biden might send heat pumps to Europe so we don't have to use, the Germans don't have to use Russian gas. You know, like having to have a conversation with someone about what a heat pump is and how your energy system would be different. And like, people have just been so disengaged. We've been invited to see our energy system as just being something where we click a switch and pay a bill, rather than understanding this incredible and quite beautiful technological infrastructure that we all live with and that build our modern world. And for me, that's actually more of a struggle than the science, because the science is pretty basic. I think when the climate skeptic movement was a little bit more active, people tried to derail climate action by concentrating on the science. And I think one of the ways in which the climate movement has helped move things on a bit is going, well, that's important, still researching it is helpful. But I mean, there are key areas still within that. So the big UN climate talks that happened last winter, they happen every year at the end of the year, and the last ones were in Glasgow. And there was a particularly kind of big one. And there was a lot of talk there about methane. There was this big display where they invited people to have a methane moment, which led to quite a lot of fart jokes. But it was a way in which people are trying to shift the conversation in climate change away from being dominated just by carbon, because for very understandable reasons, I think we focused on carbon. And when we talk about other greenhouse gases, we tend to talk about them as if they're carbon. We kind of talk about carbon equivalents, but that can mean that we focus an awful lot on fossil fuels and methane. Well, fossil fuels have methane emissions, and also agriculture. It's really important for us to appreciate the role of agriculture in global warming, and methane is part of that puzzle. And so the word carbon has dominated. Like, there's so many climate projects that are called carbon narratives, or they have something that playful around carbon, and people do artistic things around carbon because it's dominated the conversation for so much. But actually there are other greenhouse gases, and there are people trying to bring that into the discourse. So maybe we'll see a bit more chemistry chat in the future years for that reason.
Once you start noticing word choice in this conversation, first of all, it makes you very hyper aware of what you're saying, but you just breezed right on through natural gas, because that's an accepted term now. But that was its own euphemism from the beginning.
I know, I love natural gas. Well, that was me going, oh, whoops, I'm talking to Americans. I need to say natural gas, because in the UK, we don't have this problem, because we call what we put in our car petrol. So we don't use gas in the way that you use gas. And so we just say gas. But I think, so it was called natural gas, I think, and this is a really good example of how it's a phrase that already exists, and then some PR spins are like, oh, I'll have that and promote that. So it was called natural gas, I think, really importantly, to distinguish between the way in which people's gas networks were first built, initially in the UK, but they quickly moved over to the States and other parts of Europe at the beginning of the 19th century to light people's homes. So that's where we get the expression gaslight, because people's homes were built with these pipes that piped gas around their house. Then they would burn the gas. It's a movie, some of you probably have seen it, which has the analogy gaslight. If not, right. Google it, because it's a great story. But yeah, so houses would be lit by gaslight, and that's actually the kind of infrastructure for that, where you have these pipes that you'd have a central place that would make the gas, and they would be piped around homes. That's how Edison kind of built on his idea of a networked electricity supply, and it's really influential in how we do energy. But that gas initially was produced almost exclusively by burning coal, and it was manufactured gas. And people would talk about it sometimes as town gas, because it generally was in towns, or sometimes coal gas, because it was made by coal, or manufactured gas. And that's where you'd have these big kind of places that would store gas. You'd burn loads and loads of coal to make the gas. It's incredibly toxic. This is why you also have stories in old books of people committing suicide using the oven, because the gas in the oven was just so incredibly toxic from making it from coal. And then particularly in the US, there were more places where you could get the gas that just came from the ground. So when you're drilling for oil, you'd also find gas, and no one could do much with it. They normally just burn it off. But people were like, this is useful stuff. Can we put it in one of our pipes rather than having to burn all this coal to make this gas? And they called that natural gas because it just came out of the ground, and it seemed like a distinction between this manufactured gas. And so that was just a way of people, as the technology shifted towards, we managed to store and transport this gas that came out of the ground more easily. And now virtually all gas comes now from the kind of what we call natural gas. But that's what that distinction is. And then in the 70s, people were like, let's make it seem like a clean gas. Right. Because they were like, we're not coal, we're not oil, we're going to be the bridging fuel. And then they love the phrase natural gas. And so now you've got climate activists that not having any of this, don't like this word natural attached to it. That's way too positive. So pushing phrases like fossil gas or methane gas, which I'm all for, although it is a lot easier if you're British, you just say gas.
Well, we've talked about words characterizing the problem, but the words characterizing The other elements of it are also, you mentioned natural, clean, green. These are all words sort of without particularly specific meaning that are thrown around to convey a feeling.
Yeah, and I think it's something that frustrates me sometimes about my job is that I'm expected to use words like clean about energy, and I hate it because I'm like, it makes me feel like things like really problematic terms about clean eating. You're like, what do you mean by clean? Like, that's not necessarily a helpful phrase. And like, really, truly, no energy is entirely clean. And okay, it's cleaner, but it's only, that's a very subjective concept. Like, what's your idea of clean? Like, maybe it's even an analogy, it's a metaphor. It's not actually you have to have a constructed idea of what clean means for this to be applicable, and then it's maybe understandable that then gets twisted by other people and used for PR and one of the phrases I think is quite interesting is environmentally friendly. Like, I was like, when did that emerge? I think that emerged in like the 80s, and like, what does that even mean? Like, sort of friendly to the environment, but you can see why it gets stuck on products because people like that. There's been a thing in the UK recently I was reading about fashion brands realizing that they can put a big premium on anything that says sustainable. So I'm sure there are loads of like fashion brands that they're the same ones, like H&M, they're the same companies all over the world. You go in and you'd be like, oh, this is sustainable, and it's like a little bit off-white. That makes me feel good about that, buying this fast fashion thing. Oh, and it's like $5 more, but that's okay because I feel good. And they've realized that they can charge like $5 more for each thing if they've just got the word sustainable on it. But sometimes those claims are quite erroneous. And there's not, most countries don't have any way of like saying to the retailers, like, you need to justify what you mean by that. And they will have a different way of producing it. They might have cotton might have a particular source, or might have used particular dyes, but they hide like the details of actually what might count as sustainable or environmentally friendly with this very broad brush, like, hey, it's good for the world, make you feel happy about the fact that you spent money on something you probably don't need.
What do they think they're saying when they say sustainable?
Well, like the fashion brands. I mean, I think they're saying you'll feel good about it when you buy it. I think there is a bit of an aesthetic to it as well. Like there is like that kind of, it looks a bit different. It might be a bit faded. I mean, really the only sustainable clothing is secondhand clothing, really.
And obviously it's not regulated in any way. It's like organic or natural or something with food here in the US.
Well, this is why I was this was why I was noticing this news story this week, was that there was a particular policy group that was suggesting that we should regulate it. And it's a sort of thing that might be regulated at the EU, which would have a big impact globally because so many of these brands are European based. It's something that a national government could try and do, but it would be difficult because most of these brands are so globalized. And it's certainly been very, very difficult to deal with kind of other issues around fashion, the kind of things like human rights tracking and stuff like that, supply chain stuff in fashion as it is. So I imagine it'd be quite tricky. But yeah, it's interesting you mentioned organic, because that can have a very specific definition, and you have or fair trade, the fair trade symbol, and you can have bodies that have that. There's been things like that with sustainable fishing and stuff, and you get controversies around any of these logos about what that means. Some people would argue about the meanings that get pulled into the organic certification, but if groups that set up a badge like that can gain power, maybe we'll see an independent body setting up some kind of idea for sustainable fashion, and so we'll see brands compete to have it with a particular label, just like we have seen kind of companies badge themselves as organic, and there being a particular market for that. Although I think with fashion it's just, really, it's secondhand, it's repair, it's not buy, which is slightly different from food.
Right. Presumably they are trying to convey that the resources used in the garment are not being depleted by their use.
I think it's that. I don't think it's that specific. I think they're so vague. I think it's just this allusion to goodness. Although, some of them will, like, I am quite interested in this. When you see these, I'm like, oh, let me look at this label. What claims are they making? Are they justifying it? And some of them will, specify. I think that's worth doing. I think that's worth asking when you are buying products, being like, let's say if you wanted to buy something like jeans, that's a very high carbon product, but you might be like, all right, I'm investing in a new pair of jeans. They're going to cost me some money, but they're going to last. And you're like, well, I'm investing, just if you're investing in a high carbon, high cost product that you use regularly, you do your research, and it might be worth like emailing the companies and saying like, what do you mean when you say this? And some of them will, like particularly with things like jean companies, I think you do see a lot more detail about what they mean by the different sustainability claims they make. And we have seen brands like Allbirds, the shoes, and there's controversies about whether they're sustainable. We see big arguments online with people talking about that. So you do see sort of how that becomes more of a discussed term.
What about the term renewable?
Well, that is another interesting one. Yeah, I think again, it's got a bit of a history. Like, I think that, I think it came from an idea of sort of distinguishing from nuclear as well, and kind of energy politics of the 70s, and the idea of rather than burning something, kind of it's renewable. But I don't know how maybe it distracts us a bit from some of the other aspects of those technologies and how they're different from each other. Like, I think we can kind of stick. So wind is a really good example, actually, because wind out at sea, which I know in the US are only really starting to kind of embrace as a tech. Like, that technology is incredible. The innovation around offshore wind in the last 20 years is outstanding. They're monsters. I don't know if any of you've had a chance to see one of them being built, but they are like, you can see photographs of like a person standing next to one of their blades. They are giant. And an offshore wind farm would, the power they produce is just incredible. And that's very different from a farm having maybe a few small wind turbines that they use, or even a medium-sized onshore wind farm, like the ones that are already like pretty incredible, like compared to like the first wind farms that you like, the very first wind farm that was built out, I think in California in the early 80s. The difference between a Californian wind farm in the mid 80s and today is huge. But still, the difference between an onshore wind farm and an offshore one is huge. And I think it's important for us to see those as slightly different technologies. You have to have a huge amount of capital to be able to build an offshore wind farm. You have to have millions and millions and millions of dollars behind you before you can do that. Whereas a community can get together and buy a wind farm themselves. A farmer can build a wind turbine themselves. Like, you can build your own wind turbine. In fact, people have DIY build your own wind turbine projects. You couldn't really do DIY an offshore wind turbine. And I think that maybe this term renewable, we've maybe outgrown this term renewables because there's just so many different technologies and growth and divergence within them.
Well, I wonder if also, and someone in the audience brings this up, that renewable was to differentiate from fossil fuels because there's a limited supply of those. But have we also outgrown it because running out of fossil fuels is sort of the least of our worries?
Yeah, so I started thinking that and then went off in another direction. But yes, totally. There was a lot of people were really worried that we would run out of coal or oil or gas. And you see this worry.
Right, there was that whole peak oil graph that we all saw, right?
We probably remember this, like, peak oil was always like when it was kind of an economic question as much as anything else. But like, you see this, that the British Empire in the 19th century was constantly terrified that they were going to run out because they had loads of coal in Britain, and that had helped fuel, they were already quite a dominant world power. And the fact that they managed to harness the steam age very early, the earliest inventors of things like the steam engine, and then they had it in their own literal backyard to get up themselves, really gave them so much confidence. Like, we're a world leader, and we're literally steaming around the world. And they were terrified that they'd run out of coal. And they were looking over and they'd be like, America's massive, like, it's not going to run out of coal. But then you also see Americans being like, at some point, even in this giant country, we're going to run out of it. And then as the 20th century went on, it didn't take long after people started taking climate change seriously in the kind of mid 20th century. People were like, the problem is not that we'll run out of it. It is that we will burn what we've got. And I think solidly for the last 40 years, that's really been very clear. And this concept of unburnable carbon, this phrase, unburnable carbon, and phrases like keep it in the ground. You see climate campaigners using that really in the last 10 years. There was a big paper that came out in Nature, I think about 10 years ago, which sort of quantified how much of the known gas reserves and oil reserves and coal reserves we had to keep in the ground. And so you see climate activists using this phrase, keep it in the ground, and that we can't dig up what we've got, rather than thinking, oh no, it's fine to just rather than thinking like we'll run out of it at some point.
Unburnable coal. I've never heard that phrase.
Yeah, it's the sort of unburnable carbon is the phrase that's often used. It's the sort of, it is a quite techie one, but it's to talk about how, and stranded assets is another one kind of techie phrase, is sort of how we need to think about, because it's not, if you're like an oil company, like your setup for over 100 years has been, let's find as much oil as there is and suck it out the ground. And you'd be like, well, we've run out of it over there, we're going to find some more there. And you've been constantly delighted by how much your geologists have been able to find more, because this concern that we might run out of it, it's actually been quite unfounded, because there's an awful lot still there. Yeah. And so if you're coming at it from a sense of like, well, we're going to deplete our reserves, we have to stop before we go anywhere near depleting our reserves, depleting the ones that are even known, let alone looking to new places.
We have a question about the term resilience, which is used in all sorts of ways, like sustainability, with connections to adapting to climate change. How do you feel about the term resilience?
That's another really good one. I think that's it's a tricky one. I mean, I think that we talk about the need to have resilience, but I think it can be used to put the focus of to put the stress and the danger and the difficult work on us as the public, rather than why should we have to be resilient? Maybe we could have a world where we don't have to be resilient. Why can't we demand a world where we're happy and we don't have to be resilient to it? And then at the same time, we are already at about 1 degree Celsius global warming, which is a lot. We need to build buildings that are resilient to floods. We need to think about climate resilient crops and thinking about how we grow food in a way that will withstand drought. And I think to some extent we need to accept that there's an element of resilience that will be required to survive the global warming that we've inherited. But yeah, it's a slippery one, and I think it can be used to put the load and the responsibility on the people who are most vulnerable to climate impacts, rather than the people who actually have the power to prevent those things. I think we should be demanding protection from climate impacts rather than just demanding people are resilient to them. Although we also need to support each other to help us to be as resilient as possible. But it's a slippery one. It's a very slippery one. I think we should always be suspicious when we see a politician using the word.
Well, I think there's just so many different nuances to the diction here. There's accuracy, there's characterizing something as a means to action or urgency, and there's this sort of underlying sort of morality or indignation almost, I think, in a lot of these terms that has this sort of built-in judgment, and I wonder if that turns people off of this debate, if it feels like you're constantly being told you're not doing enough.
Yeah, I think so. And I think there's a sort of there are cultural subgroups that, like just with everything, like you signal which music what kind of music you're interested in, or what generation you are by the language you use. And I think we can see kind of cultural subgroups around the different words that people use and phrases people use around climate change, like phrases like environmentally friendly or sustainability, and or even just using them at all. And sometimes those can be really powerful, because you're signaling to somebody, oh, I'm part of your gang, we use the same language, and people like that. But sometimes you're like, oh, I'm using this language, and people look at, oh, I don't trust these people using that language. And yeah, I definitely think there's a lot of feeling of guilt and shame that can come with thinking about climate change, particularly in times of those of us who live in richer countries who need to cut our carbon emissions, frankly. Like if you're a middle class person who lives in the UK, or like I do, or the US, you probably need to think about how you live, because other people are going to be disproportionately affected by the carbon emissions of our lifestyle, and that's difficult for us. And there's a lot of, even if we don't feel guilt, I think there's just a lot of fear, and I think we need we need to have spaces to be able to express that. I think one of the things that's actually really important in terms of how we talk about climate change is that we give spaces for people to express their fears and their angers, or the things where they're not sure about. Maybe we might call it eco-anxiety, or just all sorts of other different emotions that we have, and give them space and be like, it's okay to feel like that. It's okay to feel confused or not sure or angry or guilty, because it is an emotional thing. It's not just a scientific thing. I know we get given a lot of science when people talk about climate change, and it gets framed to us as a scientific problem. It's one that science has found for us, and has helped us discover, but to live through it is actually very emotional. And I think it's important we find better words maybe to help us express those feelings.
Mm-hmm. Do you find when you tell people what you do that they unload some of that on you?
I will say that I do occasionally not tell people what I do because of that. So it depends on whether I can be bothered for it. It's also, I think anyone might have this feeling like you're on a day off and you've gone to get your hair cut or something, and the stylist's like, what do you do? And you're like, oh, I'm gonna have to tell you about work. Like, well, if I just sort of say, like, I say I work in comms, and then they'll be like, oh, right. But if I say I work in climate change, then they'll want to talk to me about climate change. Like, I just don't want to talk about climate change. But when I do say to people, I work in climate change, I have found people it's not that they want to unburden their guilt. It's more they leave the subject because they feel guilty, or they're really into it themselves and they want to tell me all about their activism, and they're like, oh, you too. And then they're like, and that happens increasingly, I find. What I do find though is people who are my friends, who I've known for years, they do sometimes come to me and tell me that like, they'll sometimes tell me that they've recycled or something, and I'll be like, well done. Or they'll hide stuff from me. They won't tell me that they're taking a flight or whatever, and I'm like, it's fine. You do you. I can say that nationally, the people of the UK need to cut their flying without judging you for taking a trip to see your granny. Like, that's a different thing. So yeah, people do that for all sorts of other different things in their lives.
Always. We have a bunch of audience questions, so I want to rip through some of these. Someone says, from my perspective, working with people in low-income countries, the climate has already changed. So is it something more like climate worsened disasters we need to be talking about versus the climate itself?
Yeah, I know it's like something I quite often say to people about having studied the history of the public debate about climate change. And I really think people, even climate campaigners, don't really appreciate is we talk about catastrophe and averting catastrophe. So you'll see people come out, the politicians will leave a big UN conference and they'll be like, we need to avert catastrophe. Like, people in the 80s and 90s in small island states were saying, this is catastrophic now. Like, the level of global warming that had been cooked up by the late 80s, for some people was already catastrophic. And what these politicians really mean when they come out and say, we're averting catastrophe in 2050, is that they mean that it might get bad enough that it'll hit even the richer people who would otherwise be able to hide from it. So yes, the climate has been changing, but I think that's true for people in lots of richer countries as well. Like, when climate change first made the front page of the newspapers in 1989, in the late 80s, made the front page of the New York Times with this statement from James Hansen, a NASA climate scientist. He was giving he gave a talk, he gave a presentation to Congress, and he said the climate change is happening now already. And people, it made the front page and it resonated. He was invited to go on loads of breakfast TV shows over the weekend and stuff. Back then, in the late 80s, before some of your audience were born, like when I was very, very little, because that resonated with people. Like, yeah, it has. They're like, definitely. And I found a newspaper article from 1912. There's this really amazing magazine article in Popular Mechanics where they look at the weather data that by that point they had quite good data in the Smithsonian for several decades, and so they could look back and they would go, oh, you talk to these old men and they say winters aren't what they used to be. Are they just like old people being weird, or are winters really getting warmer? And they looked at the data and they were like, yeah, it's getting warmer. And they put that together with what then was a little bit out there theory about carbon dioxide warming the earth. And there's this long Popular Mechanics piece from 1912. They talk at length about how burning coal is making the earth warmer. And one of the reasons they wrote this, and it resonated, and it got picked up by newspapers around the world. There's a snippet of an article that was actually in a New Zealand newspaper that for some reason goes viral on the internet every now and again, and people email me and go, look, have you seen this? I've seen this. You might have seen it. It's a 1912 headline from New Zealand about how coal is causing global warming. One of the reasons why that was a story in 1912 was people were like, yeah, it's weird. And you see climate change concerns bubble up again in the 1950s. And I found this really amazing edition of the New York Times magazine, weekend magazine from, I think it was like 55 or something. And they had an article in it about global warming. But it also had loads of reports of just like how hot that summer was. And it had reports from their correspondents from different parts of the US and just how farmers were really struggling, how tourist hotspots were booming, that some of them were also really struggling because it was too hot. And like, people felt that, like they really felt it in the 50s. And it's not a future thing now, but I don't think it was a future thing back then either.
Which brings up, we have a question from the audience about deniers, asking, are there deniers in the UK in the same way there are here, and is it political?
We have it less. I think that there was, if you look at climate politics in the 80s, you had lots of people on both the left and the right talking about the need for climate action. You had people like George Bush Sr. and Margaret Thatcher both talking about it quite a lot. And the groups, there's a great book by Eric Conway and Naomi Oreskes called Merchants of Doubt, which outlines a kind of work that people deliberately, it's PR companies that were paid for by oil companies particularly, put into spreading what was a natural doubt. Like whenever there's any kind of new science, there's always some people who don't believe it. Some people believe the world is flat. That just is humanity. And they took that and they extended it and they emphasized it to peddle doubt. And it grew into what we might now think of as climate denial. And that was particularly effective in the political right. And I think it seems to be that people actively courted the political right, as well as there being various different historical reasons why. Also, the left saw climate change, I think, as an opportunity, a political opportunity. Like Thatcher, I think, saw huge political risks and opportunities, and she did not want the left to claim it. She was like, no, the right has to own it. And then other things took over, and she decided to change her mind, and other people have more power and things. But she got that in the 80s, and I think that's one of the reasons she had that division. In the UK, there's just less polarity or polarization in politics generally. And also both right and left have quite a strong relationship to science. Generally, the UK likes, British people like science more than Americans, which isn't necessarily a good thing. They sometimes uncritically like science. It's not always coming from a good place, even if it can make science policy a bit easier sometimes. And the right in the UK had quite a good relationship with the environment movement, although that's true in the US too. But anyway, I mean, we do have what you might call climate deniers. They're just not very powerful, and there aren't many of them. And the most powerful group have recently rebranded as a kind of what they call net zero scrutiny, which means that they're not questioning that climate change is happening. They're questioning whether we need to do anything about it. And they're emphasizing the negative impacts of climate change policies. So emphasizing kind of, oh, well, if you close down this airport, then these people's jobs will go. Some of which are, things that we definitely need. They're using lots of political opportunities of like where people are coming up with bad climate change policies, and they're scrutinizing them, but they're making political hay out of that, arguably because they want to keep some people who are involved in those groups or funding them would quite like us to stick on fossil fuels. I sometimes call them the group formerly known as climate skeptics. And people like Naomi Oreskes, who's a massive expert on all of this, would say, they're climate delayers. They always have been climate delayers. They were never there were some people who were climate skeptics, genuine skeptics, but they were promoted through people who just wanted to delay action. And that's the key problem throughout all of it.
Mm-hmm. Well, it almost feels as if the whole continuum shifts. I mean, if one end used to be, it's not happening, and then it moved to, it's happening, but it's not humans' fault. And then it moved to, it's happening and humans have an influence over it, but it's not that bad, right? And the other end went from, it's pretty bad and we should pay attention, to catastrophe, extinction, the whole spectrum has moved.
And to some extent, that's understandable. That's like how time has passed on. Like one of the things I noticeable about climate politics is that it doesn't really catch up with history. Like people talk about how it's a future problem still, in the same frames and the same language and the same way they did it, like they did in the 60s and 70s. And you're like, that future that they talked about in the 70s was 20 years ago. Like that's what happens with time. It moves on. You know, futures have a habit of catching up with us. And I almost wonder if the concept of the year 2000 was like part of the problem. So you had all these people in the late, like a lot of us will remember this, like in the late 20th century, people would talk about the year 2000 like it was this future thing that you couldn't think beyond. You know, like beyond the year 2000, we'll all be like living in the Jetsons and on jetpacks, or like there'll be the Y2K bug and everything will fall apart. And then it was 2001 and it was like, oh, it's very similar to 1999. Maybe genes are a little bit lower or something, you know, like just it hasn't shifted that much. But I still think I think that thing about like what it will be like in the year 2000 and it's super futuristic continued to be a problem, like well into you know, the aughts, you know, quite well into like 2005, 2008. And I still think it's sometimes some people still struggle with the fact that, you know, it's 22 years after the year 2000 and we've got whole degrees more warming.
Yeah, but still no jetpacks. We have an audience member says, we were able to successfully repair, quotations included, the hole in the ozone layer, correct? Which is why we don't hear about the ozone so much now, I assume. Do you think talking more about human successes to big environment challenges, such as the ozone layer, would actually help to overcome the current climate crisis? I feel like highlighting more of what we've actually accomplished previously might give the public more confidence to overcome and makes the goal seem less impossible, thus mobilizing people.
That's a great question. So I'm going to say the second half of that first and say yes. And the climate charity I work for is like our focus is showing people positive solutions and showing off things that are done to give. If that was all that anyone talked about, that would be a problem because we do need to talk about the devastation and the impacts. But we're like the bit of the ecosystem that we live in is like, look, this is the positive future. This is the thing that's already happening. Look at how much incredible success we've had with wind turbines, whatever. And this was the thing when I finished writing my book, I expected to be really, really depressed about how little action had taken on climate change. And mainly I was, but I was also quite impressed with how much we'd done. Like, because actually all of the climate science that we have learned, it's amazing that humanity has the knowledge that we have. It's amazing that we have the technologies that we have. And that kind of gave me, I don't know if hope's the right word, but it lifted my spirits a bit and it made me feel strengthened. And I think it's something we should hold on to, is that like, we shouldn't take for granted like how many resources we've inherited as well as how much of a mess we've inherited. But the thing about the hole in the ozone, and this is a really interesting language thing, is that it's not necessarily a hole. Like the greenhouse effect isn't really a greenhouse. So I don't know if like, I'd really be in every now and again, I'm like, maybe I need to go and sit down with an atmospheric scientist and get them to tell me what they think it really is. Like, is it a graze or would they really hate that too? But the story is that it's just like it's a natural phenomenon that doesn't necessarily fit into human language. You know, it is whatever it is. And people are trying to define what this is. So we're doing the science to learn more about it so they could get a grip of it with the language. And they realized it was what you might call damage. Again, this is kind of, you know, the words that we put upon the natural world, these human words is sort of fitting a particular image of it. They're like, oh, it's damage and we want to talk about it. It's a dangerous thing. How we can talk about it. And the story was that the nature of a hole, the word hole, came from a press release written by NASA. So it's some unnamed press officer wrote hole because they were just like, I can't deal with this scientific description. It doesn't make sense. I'm going to call it a hole. And actually, this is a very powerful term because a hole is something you feel like you could fix. You feel like you should fix. Like there's a hole in my bucket. I need to fix it. And so this, I think that one of the reasons we had so much action on the ozone layer was that it was framed as a whole. If that press officer had said it's a bit of a graze, people go, oh, you leave a graze, heals on its own. And I think that's it's like one of my go-to examples when I'm doing like the role of science and language is like the hole in the ozone layer. So yes, it is to some extent it's a success story. There are problems with CFC trading and you can go down really deep. It's worth Googling because it's not necessarily a straightforward success story. But that is, you know, the answer is yes, we should talk about good things that humans have done and celebrate that because that is help us find ways forward. But also we should remember that language can be really powerful in helping us point us in particular directions.
Sure can. Someone ought to make a museum about it. We have an audience member say, thank you for bringing up Don't Look Up. Do you find it to be a good tool to communicate the current attitudes on climate and climate action?
So whenever there's some kind of climate change and culture thing, I'm like, I should read it or watch it, and it's work. And I haven't read the King Stanley Robinson book yet, and apparently I should, and I'll love it. But I just, every time I finish work, I'm like, I don't want to read about climate change. But I knew I should watch, like, look up. So what I did was I turned it into like a team building exercise, and I told my team we'll watch it together, and we'll all sit at home and watch it, and we'll talk about it on WhatsApp. So I tried to make it into a fun thing for them, which was just me making myself watch it. But it meant I watched it with my colleagues, and we all talked about, like, we kind of dug into like the meaning of it. And I think it's really good that it has the mainstream place it had on Netflix. And I think it's really great that we are making movies about it. And it was amazing to see how many people watched it and talked about it over Christmas. It's flawed in places, like there's bits of it, like I'm like, I don't think the comet is the right analogy. I think there's lots of things to do with the inequalities of climate change that I think are brushed over by looking at it through the lens of a comet. And I would really like to see more films and more cultural products that allow us to think about that issue of inequality, because I think climate justice and the inequalities of how much climate impacts people and who causes it and who is hurt by it is something we need to talk about more. But I think mainstream media talking about climate change is generally a good thing. And if you know, lots of people have seen this, lots of people commissioning TV will have seen the success of that, and I hope we'll make more. And so I'm looking forward to there being lots of really bad climate TV and climate comedy and climate books, because that'll just show that it's in culture, because for years there was just none of it, nothing at all. So yeah, it's not perfect, but I think actually let's have lots more imperfect, because no one knows how to do it properly either. I think lots of people sit there with climate comms and storytelling and like, we have to get it perfect. So we don't get it perfect, we're like, it's the most important thing in the world. And like, no one knows how to do it. So let's just try different stuff. So, well, we tried the comet thing. Let's try something else.
Someone asked, can Ms. Bell share where the research about the impact of these words about the climate have appeared, and is it accessible to the public?
There's lots of different bits in different places. There is a place to look is the Yale Climate Research Group. If you Google Yale Climate, they do a lot of stuff on climate comms and pull stuff together. There are various different research bodies that do studies on things like climate in the media. There are centres in Boulder and in Oxford. But yeah, and a really big new centre in University of Cardiff that looks at social psychology of climate change. They do quite a lot of research looking at how people frame climate change and think about it. But there just isn't much on it at all, really. And yeah, most of it isn't super accessible either. It's sort of social psychology. So if you're a social psychologist, it's probably fine, but not necessarily for most of us.
Someone asks, curious about your perspective on the terminology and use of carbon footprint.
Yeah, carbon footprints are really interesting. That's another one that everyone gets like conspiracy theory about. They're like, you know, it was invented by BP. I mean, it wasn't invented by BP. It was promoted by BP because this idea of a footprint, the idea is, I mean, what it can do is individualize it a bit. And so I think arguably some people have promoted the idea of climate footprinting because it actually stalls action on climate change rather than encourages it, because it makes us all sit about and look at our own carbon footprint. We look there and we go, oh, this part of my life does this and this and this. And then we feel guilty about it and then we don't do anything. And so some very clever PR people realize that if they promoted the idea of a carbon footprint, they're like, oh, it's really important that we think about this and we care about this, but actually they're stalling action. And there's also, you know, big companies, particularly oil companies, that are responsible for huge amounts of carbon emissions, going, oh, what about you with your carbon emissions of like your drive to work or your holiday last year? You're like, what's your carbon emissions? You know, and that's definitely a key like spin. It's straight out of like the PR playbook for just like avoiding the topic. And it was one actually that the anti-littering campaigns were started in the 60s, rather than getting the packaging companies to think about not producing throwaway packaging like plastic bottles or even glass bottles back then, they put the responsibility on the users. They said, oh, your littering is your problem. The litter bug is the problem, not the person who produced the packaging in the first place. Now, obviously littering is bad. So everyone's like, oh, yeah, littering is bad. And you're like, I can't argue against that. Littering is bad and irresponsible. Like, yes, but that's meaning we're not looking at the larger structural problem. So I think footprinting is being used very effectively as a way of stopping people from taking climate action, but I wouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater. And I think there's been a lot of I think one of the areas in which it really comes into its own is when you look at the carbon footprints of an average British person versus an average Kenyan or something, just like for looking at the global inequalities. And also I read some research recently that looked at, it used kind of carbon footprinting as an approach to look at how older demographics are more likely to have higher carbon footprints. And I just think it's really important that we look at, like, there was a Nature editorial recently just on the demographics of carbon footprinting. And I think to some extent those are academic processes, research projects that are looking at those things. But I think for us as everyday people, it's worth us knowing that and knowing a bit about how much more carbon an average American creates in their everyday life compared to average person in another part of the world. And I think it's really important that we see those inequalities, and that carbon footprinting done well can invite us to have a conversation about inequality. So be skeptical when you see people promoting it, especially if it's an oil company. But at the same time, it can be a really, really powerful tool for climate justice.
We are almost out of time, but I read an earlier interview with you where you said that you like to balance the sort of fear and urgency with courage. So that feels like a nice place to end. What can we take courage from? What would show courage on our part?
First of all, I just want to credit Kate Marvel as a NASA climate scientist for saying that, because people used to talk about hope all the time, and I was like, I don't really like this word hope, it doesn't resonate with me. And she wrote this amazing essay about climate courage, and I was like, yes, that's more of it, strengthening. I find climate courage from people taking action and doing something. And when I feel terrified and scared because there's some terrible weather event happening, and I don't really know where to go next. I guess it's that classic thing of look at the people helping. I know it's really corny, but it does help. And if I'm doing something myself, I went and did some tree planting recently, and I only planted a few hundred trees. That's not going to save the world, but it really made me feel a lot better about it. And I spent the time talking to other people about climate change while we did it, and like thinking about all the other bigger things we'll do than just planting a few trees. And so I think that's the thing that lifts me out of the funk and gives me that feeling of courage. And I did feel it right in the book, like I felt really depressed in so many different points, but seeing people just like invent the whole of modern climate science, like, that's incredible. It's incredible what we've done, that people working across the world over different countries and generations and disciplines have developed modern climate science. It's dazzling and it's wonderful, and I think we should take some hope and inspiration from that. But whatever we call it, whether we call it hope, inspiration, courage, strength, or not being too depressed, I think we can find some of it there.
Well, Alice Bell, Director of Communications for Possible. Her book is called Our Biggest Experiment. It's been a treat to spend an hour with you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me.
And thank you all for being here. I hope to see you at another program soon. Have a good day.